Welcome in, everyone, to another edition of Just Another College Football Podcast. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Wednesday, March 26th, and we have a great show. Spring practice has started all around the country, so we have a couple of spring practice / kind of off-season questions, some grandiose things that I want to get into today, including can the SEC get back on top of the sport in 2025? Then we got to talk about some teams with the most to prove next season. Obviously, Penn State has a big-time target on their back. Going into 2025, a huge year for them, sort of a title or bust year. We'll get into that in that second segment. Definitely a lot of other teams that we'll get into probably going into next week, frankly. Then we'll do a little bit of a midweek catch-up. Obviously, the big story is around UGA, another couple of traffic incidences that happened in Athens, and we'll talk about that plenty in the last segment. But let's go ahead and jump into this thing. There's tons of stuff to get into. Obviously, if you would like to like and subscribe, would mean the world to me. Any questions or comments you have, please leave them in the comment section. I will absolutely include them in next week's show. If you want to follow me over on X or any of the Instagram apps, any of that type of stuff, it's Thomas_Brzee. Please feel free to follow on over there and interact with me all you want. Love talking college football, and we'll take any questions that you guys have. But let's go ahead and jump into some questions that I had, at least to start off the spring practice / kind of the off season that we're getting into. There's a lot of different things to kind of jump into, and I think one of the big ones that we're going to be watching for is which transfer quarterback makes the biggest effect? Which is the guy that really jumps off the page from spring, obviously going into fall? Who's the guy that kind of steals all the headlines? And there's a number of really good options. I think John Mateer kind of takes the cake. The Washington State quarterback from a year ago that found his way over to Oklahoma, over 4,000 yards a year ago, over 40 touchdowns, remarkably talented dual threat quarterback, and a guy that Oklahoma very badly needs. I don't think I need to tell any of you guys that Oklahoma had their fair share of issues on the offensive side of the ball, especially with that offensive line, and having this guy in your backfield makes that a little bit easier for that offensive line because he can make plenty of plays on his own. Now, I think the rest of Oklahoma will be plenty fine going into 2025, but this guy gives you a leg up. There's no doubt about that. And then you got guys like Carson Beck, and we'll have to wait until summer to see exactly what he looks like. We'll talk about that a little bit when we talk about Miami in the next segment. And then Thomas Castellanos down at Florida State, kind of comparing himself to Jameis Winston already, so a little bit aggressive, but at the end of the day, love the confidence there. And then Fernando Mendoza is a really interesting guy coming over from Cal, going to Bloomington to join Indiana, and Curt Cignetti, going to be really interesting to see what he can do. Obviously, Indiana, they want to get back to the CFP. That's where they want to be going forward, and he's going to have to be the guy that leads them there this time around. And then you got Connor Wegman down at Houston, Miller Moss at Louisville, which is a very interesting team, and definitely a team that could find their way back right into the CFP conversation next year. And then Darian Menso, we all know the price tag that he took to go from Tulane to Duke, and that's going to put a lot of expectations on his back. There's no doubt about that. So that'll be a fascinating thing to watch. Obviously something that we will unpack as spring goes on, but for me, John Mateer kind of takes the cake among these transfer quarterbacks. But another thing, new hires are a thing that we're going to have to be watching for, and obviously a lot of those eyes are going to go to Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Obviously everyone's going to be watching what Bill Belichick is doing, how he's going about his business. Already has gotten a couple of huge visits. I saw that Larry Fitzgerald's son was going to go to UNC here pretty soon for a visit, so that'll be a very interesting thing to watch. Obviously, the expectations will be really interesting. I'm not sure exactly what UNC fans are thinking. If you're a UNC fan, please let me know what you're thinking this season's going to look like in the comments. But at the end of the day, I do think it's a really fascinating hire, obviously. Very fascinating job, and one that could really blow up over the next couple of years, but got to hit the ground running pretty quickly because decisions and opinions will be made pretty quickly on this guy. I can promise you that. Then you do have Rich Rod over at West Virginia. Cannot wait to see what's going on there. He has already banned TikTok dances for his players, so he's doing a little bit to get them in line just a little bit more. But overall, a fascinating story. Definitely one that brings a lot of West Virginia fans a lot of happiness. There's no doubt about that, but you got to find a way to win on the field. And I think Nico Miracle is a really fun quarterback and definitely a guy that could really be a huge asset. They got Jalen Henderson coming over from Texas A&M. There's going to be a lot of interesting things to watch over there in Morgantown. Then you got Barry Odom at Purdue, Scott Frost making his return to UCF, and a ton of shifting in the group of five that will be really fascinating and could be a new hire that finds their way to the CFP. If I was to bet on one guy in particular, I think I'd have to bet on one of the group of five guys. If I'm being totally honest, these Power 5 teams, while I think the head coaching hires were very solid and will be really interesting to watch over the next couple of years, not super hopeful for these teams in 2025, at least when it comes to the CFP world. But on that G5 level, feels like there's some coaches to really watch there. Blake Harrell over at ECU is a very, very interesting one that I like a lot. But moving forward to the freshmen, we're kind of doing all the new guys around here, but the freshman quarterbacks, will they live up to the hype? And it mainly starts with Bryce Underwood. He is the show. Everyone understands that. The number one quarterback coming out of high school, and the guy that got paid $12 million to find his way to Ann Arbor, Michigan. Remarkably talented kid. Sky-high expectations. I think everyone expects him to start. I expect him to start, frankly, and if he doesn't, I think that would be a huge upset for Mikey Keene and would be great for Michigan. You know, Mikey Keene's a plenty good quarterback, but this is the guy that everyone wants to see. Number 19 is the guy that everyone wants to watch, and I tend to believe that you're going to be able to get that wish. Then you do have Julian Lewis, a really fun guy over there in Boulder that is fighting for that position with Caden Salter, very talented quarterback from Liberty. That'll be an interesting battle. I don't think Julian Sain will win that one. We talked about that one last week, so if you want to go look at my quarterback battle segment, please do so. And then Julian Lewis, Hussein Longstreet over at USC is someone I talked about him on my blog earlier. And then my dark horse is Matt Zollers. He's over at Missouri, and Bo Pribula obviously came in from Penn State and kind of that crazy incident that happened during the playoff, but Matt Zollers, very, very talented, very, very strong arm, and definitely a guy that could come on really strong during the spring and maybe be the story coming out of Columbia, Missouri after this spring camp. The big question on everyone's mind is, can the SEC find their way back to the top of the sport in 2025? And I think it relies on a couple of things. The way I look at it right now, if I'm looking at these two conferences next to each other, the SEC and the Big Ten, I'd lean slightly towards the Big Ten going into 2025. I think you have to feel great about what Penn State is getting back. You have to feel great about Oregon being who Oregon is over the last couple of years. Ohio State obviously is going to be Ohio State. Michigan bringing in more talented guys on the outside and that quarterback. There's a lot to like about what the Big Ten has to offer, and that doesn't even include Indiana, Illinois, maybe Nebraska, Wisconsin making some type of run. So a very, very talented group over in the Big Ten. For the SEC, it comes down to the quarterbacks. There's no two ways about that. Now, Diego Pavia is kind of off in his own corner, being the very veteran guy among these really talented quarterbacks, but DJ Lagway going into his first full season starting. Arch Manning, the exact same thing. And then you have guys like Nico Iamaleava going into his second year starting, but not the most experienced guy in the world. It's going to be really interesting to watch this unfold. And I think Florida is a team to really watch here, because if Florida can make the jump from 7-5 to 9-3, 10-2, whatever that looks like to get in the CFP conversation, I think the SEC is going to be really strong. You're going to have a Georgia team that will be a little bit up in the air, and I think there's a solid argument to say that maybe the SEC will just eat each other alive once again, but if Arch Manning hits the way that people think he will over in Austin, Texas, if DJ Lagway is the guy that he showed in flashes down there in Gainesville, if Gunnar Stockton can really get it going, and then Iamaleava, Sellers, all of these guys, Jackson Arnold's a very fascinating figure, and then whoever is starting down there in Tuscaloosa, all those guys are going to be hugely important, and that's where I see kind of the separation between these two conferences. Now, plenty of talented quarterbacks up in the Big Ten. Obviously, Drew Aller, obviously Julian Sain and Dante Moore getting their first chance to start, but when you look down at the SEC, there's guys all across that conference that I really think can elevate that group. Right now, I lean a little bit towards the Big Ten. You know, they've won the last two titles, and it seems like Michigan's going to get a little bit better. Nebraska's going to get a little bit better. Illinois might get a lot of bit better, so that'll be a fascinating thing to watch. But the SEC has plenty going for it. There's no doubt about that. That quarterback position might be the chief among them, and I think these guys are going to be hugely important to what the SEC is this year and obviously going forward into 2026. And then we got to find the sleepers. We got to find a way to find the teams that are hiding right under the surface in Indiana, if you will, of this year, and find that team that's really going to explode in 2025. We'll start in the SEC. Auburn is the team that I'm watching, that I think everyone's watching, frankly, and Auburn is a very, very confounding team. They're very confusing. They were in 2024. They played really good football. I believe they were top 60 in total offense and total defense, and then they would just give games away. They would turn over the ball way too often. Jackson Arnold comes in with his own turnover issues. Very talented quarterback. I do think they upgraded at that position, but the turnover issues are still very much there, and you'll have to see if you can avoid that kind of time bomb that happened at a number of end of games, like that Oklahoma game. Should have been a win for Auburn, but they gave that one away to Oklahoma, and it really kind of torpedoed a season that could have been really, really good, and they could have been very excited about 2025. I think they're a little bit wary, but I really like the talent on this team. Bringing in a guy like Eric Singleton from Georgia Tech is a huge, huge boost to this offense. And then when you have a guy like Cam Coleman, you can do a lot of really special things. A very talented sophomore wide receiver that might just be one of the best in the entire country. Then over to the Big Ten, Washington is awesome. I cannot wait to see what the Huskies can do this year. Damon Williams Jr. is the guy that I might like the most in the entire country. He is so much fun to watch. Not saying he's the best quarterback in the country, but he is going to be really, really fun to watch. Denzel Boston, Omari Evans, a couple other guys on the outside. This is a very interesting team. We saw what Jed Fish was able to do down there at Arizona when he had the quarterback in place in Noah Fafita. This is a very talented kid, and definitely a guy that, if things fall the right way for Washington, it could be a really, really dangerous team, and then maybe find their way right back into the CFP after a 1-year hiatus. Down in the Big 12, got to go to Lubbock, Texas. This is a very, very fun team that Joey McGuire is building, I believe, in his 4th year. Could be a little bit off there, but I think Barron Morton is a dude that really could hit his stride going into 2025. And when you look across those lines of scrimmage, they're a lot bigger than a lot of the other Big 12 teams. And a lot of that has to do with the portal guys they brought in. Brought in Romello Height from Georgia Tech, brought in Lee Hunter from UCF. Both really, really talented kids and just really big, really huge humans. And definitely a thing that in the Big 12, when you got big guys, you have a huge advantage over some other teams that might not quite be quite as big, and definitely will be an interesting thing to watch. But I think Texas Tech is that team that you're going to be circling, and maybe will take that role of maybe Arizona State, while Arizona State takes the role of the team leading the conference going into next year. And then over in the ACC, it's an easy choice for me. It's Georgia Tech. I think if you're not watching the Georgia Tech Yellow Jackets going into next year, you're doing yourself a disservice. Haynes King comes back for his 6th year in college football. Very talented quarterback. They have guys on the outside like Malik Rutherford, brought in Eric Rivers over from FIU. Very talented, over 1,000 yards a year ago. And then Jamal Haynes in that backfield, along with a defense that will get a new defensive coordinator, so that'll be a really interesting thing to watch. But plenty of talented guys in that group, plenty of guys coming back in that group. So we'll be a really interesting team. And that game in week 3 against Clemson, they win that one, this could very well be the team that you find in Charlotte at the very end of the year. And then we'll talk about the national champions just for 1 second. Will it be another reload for Ohio State, or would this year just be a little bit different? When you look at all the guys walking out the door to the NFL, it's hard to imagine that this team wouldn't take a little bit of a step back. I think the big thing is multiple starting offensive linemen on an offensive line that already had its fair share of issues. You know, you lose Josh Simon, you lose Donovan Jackson, very, very talented guys on 2 sides of your offensive line, and one guy that was your starting left guard had to kick out to left tackle and was incredible at that position. But then you add in Will Howard, you add in both Travion Henderson and Quinshon Judkins, and Emeka Egbuka, all of these guys on defense. It's going to be really tough to reload this thing. All that being said, I think they will reload just fine. And the reality of it is, I think they have the best offensive player in the country in Jeremiah Smith. I think they have the best defensive player in the country in Caleb Downs. And then when you have Sonny Styles coming back, Davison Igbinosun, and then you have Kenyatta Jackson. Devin Sanchez coming in as a freshman is a very interesting guy to watch. But overall, they can reload as much as they want when it comes to a talent perspective. Julian Sayin is going to make this thing go. Julian Sayin is the guy that you're going to want to watch. He is the biggest piece to all of this. He will be the starter there. I'd be very, very surprised if Lincoln Kineholtz or Tavian St. Clair came in there and won that job. I think it will be Julian Sayin. He's got to step up to the plate. He's got to be a huge leader for this team, and if he can't do that, then maybe it is a little bit of a different year for Ohio State in 2025. Maybe they lose their 5th game in a row to Michigan. They might have already lost 5 in a row. Now I'm losing track of how long it's been since they've been able to beat that team up north. But overall, very, very talented team going into next year, even losing all those guys to the NFL. But if that quarterback doesn't hit the way that they think he will hit, it's going to be a problem. Now, I'm not super worried about that. I think Ohio State will be more than fine. I think you will find them in the CFP going into next year, but there is definitely a couple of questions there and a little bit more rebuilding that needs to be done than maybe some past years over there in Columbus. But a lot of different questions that we will get to probably over the next couple of weeks. Continue to kind of brain dump on this. If you guys have any questions, leave them in the comments and I will absolutely include them in next week's show. But overall, those are a couple of questions I'm really circling. But let's take our first break. Let's take a little break here. And when we come back, we're going to talk about the teams with the most to prove. Obviously, it will have a lot to do with the questions that we just asked, but overall, a couple of teams that I think might be in kind of title or bust type years, or at least getting very close to a title. And then you have a couple of teams that just want to get back up to the top. And we'll talk about them right after this, so stick with us.